Welcome again. It's me, Timur, and Alan are your hosts. We're both co-founders at Insight Revenue, and I think we have about 45 minutes for you today. First, we want to go into why Insight messaging, like why is this important, and then we want to go into the meat of the presentation, our approach. Um, I think insight can often seem a little mysterious. We'd like to think that we've demystified the process and we've collected up the best practices and researches on the topic, and that we have a replicable way to arrive at a good end. And then we'll finish with some examples and tools and open up the session for questions and answers. A little bit about us, customary to do the introductions. We're obviously a new firm. Our business has three pillars. First, it's sort of research, consulting, and advisory. Um, the second, which is why we're here, is around insight messaging and insight in general. And then the third is the training that we deliver to bring home the concepts and learnings we've done with our clients. And this session obviously is all around the insight messaging. Thought it's useful to start with a little definition to level set in terms of what we mean. This definition here, I think, is worth reading and reflecting on a little bit. And the idea is that you're trying to arrive at an unknown or unappreciated findings that change a customer's perception of value and that therefore accelerate growth. And I think the operative words is changing the perception part is really important. This is different than a well told story, a wonderful calculation, or just sort of overwhelming people with your through your authority and your experience. The idea really is that there are certain findings. Inferences that really do change the way people think about the business, and if you can land one of those, then you have a customer for life. The interesting thing is, when we talk to clients, is people often have this somewhere. It's just gotten lost, and our job often is to try and help them surface it out and to crystallize it again, in order to help differentiate the business.
So if we,
Uh,
yeah, thanks, Timur. If we look a little bit as to from organizations why insight messaging and why it's so important, the one phrase that I like to come back to and we talk about a lot is that really when you have a lack of insight messaging, it makes it easier to commoditize the purchase. So this idea is that you know when you have insight messaging because it makes things so much easier and it makes the process that much more pleasant and easy for the entire team, even customers. But when you're missing that insight messaging, really it's easy to commoditize the process. So in terms of us at Insight Revenue, when we partner with our customers and we work on insight messaging, some of the things that we like to talk about is really insight messaging helps it quickly demonstrates value in a clear, differentiated manner. It should support and drive strategy. So insight messaging should be a part of that strategy that you have. It also, one of the positive side effects, as I like to say, is that it helps to create great alignment across the teams: product, marketing, sales, account management, customer success. The insight messaging process and insight messaging as a whole really helps to bring teams together. And last couple of points, when you're doing it well and it's working, it really excites the marketplace. It excites customers and it excites people, and it also makes the experience from the customer perspective, the journey, easier, smoother, and even more enjoyable as we see. And in terms of who contributes and who owns this process or who really should be a part of the process, we like to say, depending on the size of the organization, as many people as possible, as many teams as possible. Small organizations, it would be leadership teams, product, marketing, sales, account management. Large organizations often have dedicated departments, so it might be more product and sales and marketing coming together. But really, from our perspective, the more people that are involved in the process, the better. And last point, really, insight messaging should permeate across everything that you do in terms of customer communications. it really has quite a big impact across many different areas, starting with pitch decks and demos to tools, playbooks, and assets, website communications, social, content marketing, webinars, conferences, and even from the day-to-day perspective, what you call an elevator pitch, water cooler chats, customer exchanges, spontaneous exchanges, is where insight messaging can really surface anywhere. Thank you, Timur. And
The
so at Insight Revenue, this is why we've taken a holistic approach to making sure that insight and insight messaging is embedded across the entire customer journey, including teams from marketing, sales, customer success, account management, as I said earlier, even products. We want to make sure that we're able to identify and deliver insight and insight messaging across that entire customer experience.
And to do that, to the meat of our presentation, we actually have a structured process that we'd like to go through with you. It's the genesis of this process is really from research that I personally had actually done a while ago, 10 plus years ago, where the question really was, so what drives a sale? What drives purchases? What makes people come back again and again to a customer? And at one point, this was sort of new news. It was really new to people, and the outcome really was that at the point at which you're choosing between two or three vendors and you're making a purchase, it is the sales experience that's actually the crucial piece of the equation. It's also the most variable portion of the equation. And very specifically, what were customers looking for? Well, they were looking for valuable perspectives. They were looking for somebody to help them navigate alternatives, avoid mistakes, teach them, show them what the outcomes would be, and something that would be supported by their organization. And again, and it starts again with that valuable perspective. And so we have a sense for what it should be. Like if you were able to describe your products and solutions in terms of those terms and your customers agree, then you have a hit on your hand. And yet this is very recent research. This is data we collected this year, mostly autumn of this year. It's 50 odd companies gave us data, and they were assessing the state of various commercial capabilities. And the question was, do your messages communicate insights in terms of how you solve the customer's problems? And the answer, sadly, is an overwhelming no, not really. It's there's broad dissatisfaction with the state of customer insights. We went into this deeper on a previous session, but by and large, I think people would feel that the insights are stale, they're not resonating, and it's just not landing the point. And thus, for us, this is determined a redoubled focus around the insights generation process. The top 5 issues, for what it's worth, and I think this is helpful in terms of the things to avoid, we see are it's a lot of messaging that's still focused on us, like all the wonderful things that we do and all the wonderful sort of the many offices have, with the history we have. Not things that a customer typically much cares about. We see a lot of work that doesn't really use the customer's words. Something happens at the point at which a product description goes through sort of marketing and sales and CS, and everything starts sounding the same. One of the issues again is a sales and marketing rift. Both sides still probably a bit too siloed. Both sides trying to do different things, right? Sales is much more focused on outbound new business. Marketing is focused on sort of inbound branding, awareness. There's natural real tension there, but it can sometimes mean that instead of figuring out what's right for each purpose, you end up with something that's acceptable to everybody, but that doesn't really accomplish much. The net adopt of a lot of this is you end up with low adoption. The sort of corporate efforts are deemed to be, have been created in an ivory tower somewhere, and they're too generic. And so something we often see is an awful lot of work put in to creating materials that aren't really used very much. Maybe eventually through osmosis the content gets distributed, but certainly not the kind of effect that an impact people have often hoped for. Um, to 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 solve these issues, we've come up with a bit of a process, and a nod back again to that diagnostic I distributed there during the chat. Um, a good way to start, I think, in terms of like where are you and where do you want to go, is to look at it is to look at the presentation. Start with a pitch deck. Doesn't necessarily need to be a pitch deck, but start with the content you have in terms of like these four things. And it's evaluated on these four axes. First, is it impactful? That's very much the topic of what we're going to talk to today. Um, Second, is it beautifully produced? That's the thing that most people have most control over. There's really no excuse for a presentation that isn't beautiful. Third, is it easy? Like is it tripping up people? Alan and I watch a lot of people present presentations, and it's interesting. You can tell where people are tripped up. Sometimes, and it's a very personal thing, right? Like it needs to be flexible enough that different people can deliver it, and yet make sure that different people deliver the same thing, even if they do it in different ways. And then fourth, is it engaging and exciting? Like, is it landing with the customer? And if you think about these four axes, I think they're also useful because there's natural tension between them. Like, candidly, the impactful presentation that really does shift perspective might not always be the easiest presentation to deliver. That's going to take a lot more practice. Um, Similarly, a presentation that's engaging and exciting might sometimes give a difficult subject matter short shrift. And I think it's hard to remember. You're not literally trying to sort of, this isn't a pep rally. You're not literally trying to excite the prospect. You're trying to get them to rethink what they're doing, and to spend time with you. And sometimes what you're doing is you're prompting difficult questions. So there's natural tension between this, but I think this framework hopefully is a good way to get a handle on where things are. Um, the goal then, Alan, I think is reasonably clear.
Sure. From our perspective, and what we're going to dig into shortly is as a process that we apply not only to develop and work towards insight messaging, but also to kind of hold it against what's in place right now, so that we can see how well it stacks up against how we view the process. So really, it's about sparking interest and delivering that unique insight, and we believe it's a mix of an art and a science, and we like to have a mix of both. And I couldn't resist, but with this next slide, thank you, Timur, to introduce, of course, Don Draper. Those of you that are familiar with Don Draper, Insight, it's delicate but potent. If you've seen that episode, I absolutely love that episode, so I highly recommend it. Of course, he doesn't say insight; he says nostalgia. Um,
Still, such a good point. It is indeed delicate. It is indeed delicate, and yet I think actually eminently possible to structure and quantify. Look, here's an outline of our approach. This is a time and tested model. We've applied it elsewhere. It's well documented. And the important thing here talks is that in some ways this is a collection of six different ways of making a different point. And to make it digestible, and in terms of the creation effort, we often think of it as a single pitch deck that has all these elements. But I think it's important to realize that what you're doing is you're actually trying to make sure that you can cover all six of these axes in a conversation. And that's important because in a complex sale, realistically, you might not be able to do all six. Um, in a 45-minute presentation. You will do that over time. And again, in a complex presentation, it might also be true that you keep coming back to certain parts and that you have to deliver the same message again in different ways. But the idea here is this gives you structure in terms of all the content you have to array, and then for the sake of convenience, it puts them all together in a way that could be in one deck. Um, Let me go over very quickly what the portions are, and it starts with the sort of this idea that you need a connection. You need to earn that right to the conversation. Um, that's sort of preamble. That is not literally talking about the weather. We will go into that in a little bit. Then and only then, once you've made this connection, are you ready to sort of start on this shift. This is typically the hardest part of any insight-driven conversation, where you have to present assumptions somebody has and then make a shift and tell them something that's hopefully will change the way they think about things. At that point, you're then ready to talk about the business value, the impact this will have both on your buyer, but also the broader team around them, their direct reports, their peers, and their senior managers. And only then would we argue, are you ready to actually start presenting your solution? And even here, we would argue that you should always bide your time. First, you need to make sure that people understand what's different about your solution. Like, what key ingredient does your solution have that allows it to address the shift you've identified earlier? Again, it's a and this is an exercise a little bit in sort of strategic weighting and repetition, right? Like, you make the point, you deepen the pain, and then you make the point again. And only once it's connected do you then start talking about your solution and your product. And what and I emphasize this because again and again, what I see is an awful lot of presentations that jump straight to our difference. This makes sense, right? You love the product, you've sweated over it, and so it ends up being a lot of time around our different, you know, what we have rather than why we have what we have. So that's an overview of the process, and now we'll go a little bit deeper into it, and hopefully, if there are any items in the chat, you can address those, or Alan and I will try and chat through them. Um, but wanted to start with the warmer, the connection part. And here, this movie is getting a little old at this point. But if you've seen Jerry Maguire, at the beginning of the movie, um, the Tom Cruise character has a bit of an epiphany, and he realizes that all is wrong, and he delivers this wonderful, heartfelt speech about everything that needs to change, and how he has a vision for making everything better. And then he asks, "So who's going to come with him?" And well, I mean, if you know the thing, what happens is literally nobody goes with him. Admittedly, Renee Zellweger does, and maybe for his purposes that's perfectly enough. Um, but I use this to make the point that what you typically can't do is go in straight with a speech. But I think in people's minds, when they think insights, they think of themselves delivering something like a Jerry Maguire speech. You have a couple of minutes, and you're just going to blow them away with your insights. But the reality is like that doesn't actually work. Like you'd have to be you'd need to find your real Zellweger character for that to work. But what actually happens is that you have to prepare the ground a little bit, and you have to talk about things that matter to the prospect. Um, Very specifically, again, like the thing not to do, but we see a lot of these is an innumerable numbers of corporate presentations that literally start with the number of offices somebody has. Don't get me wrong, these can be relevant. Like if you're a global logistics company that whose value proposition is that you can serve customers wherever they are, absolutely, I think a map of coverage would be very useful. For the most part, though, it just tells us that yes, that you too have an office in, I don't know where these cities are, LA, New York, London, Paris, Beijing. That's most large companies. Um, enough of what you shouldn't be doing. Alan, what are your thoughts on like what makes a good connection?
Well, from my perspective, it's just doing the research, showing curiosity, finding as much as you can about their business, asking really genuine and heartfelt questions about their business. I wanted to throw this back at you. One of the things that always comes up is this question: what keeps you up at night? How do you feel about that, Timur?
I mean, I wouldn't literally ask it like that, but I think that that's a little hackneyed. I tend to think, honestly, this is where you document conventional wisdom. It's a little bit what we tried to do earlier on in the presentation. We tried to document. So, what are the most common problems we see, and then what are some of the assumptions around it? You're trying to prove. Especially if it's a salesperson delivering it, you're trying to prove not that you literally solve the problem yourself, obviously, but that you know enough about the problem and that you know how most customers are going to respond, and that you're actually an expert in trying to figure out, like, is this solution the right fit for them or not? And you should do this before you jump to the solution, even if, and maybe especially if your buyer's opening words are, "Look, I've done a lot of research. Let's just jump to the demo." Um, that's a hard thing, and I would tend to think you should at least try a couple of times to not literally jump to that point, because you have to make sure that there's a need, and that you're a good fit to it. But once you've done that, and let's assume you've established need, you've got a good conversation going, you've sort of identified there's a real need, there's a decent fit. Ideally, what you would do is you'd start working on the shift. You want to change somebody's perspective, in the sense that there's typically a common way to solve a problem, and then there is your way of solving the problem, and you want to get them there, and you would do that through something we call an insight. And my hope was that this page here gives you a good sense of, like, the kind of thing we're getting at. On the left hand side are some facts, hopefully some fun facts, but on the right hand sides there are some, you know, vaguely related insights. The top one is actually one of my favorites. Did you know that spiders can literally fly using electricity? They apparently drop a little bit of silk and then ride the Earth's magnetic fields. And this explains how or why spiders have been found in some of the unlikeliest of locations. Darwin apparently was befuddled by this one, because on one of his voyages he found a spider on the boat. Miles, thousands of miles from any land, with no business to be there, and he had wondered how the hell it had gotten there. Turns out it was using electricity. But that's a really fun fact. There's very little you can do with that. Its application, though, is that and an insight, and an insight that candidly is way over my head, but it was apparently wasn't wasted on Alexander Graham Bell, is that electricity can spread like a wave. So if you're Alexander Graham Bell, what this meant was that he then managed to put two and two together and actually came up with the telephone. That's, again, that's an insight that's a little bit over my head, but it worked for him. And then these other things here, these are rules of thumb around different disciplines. Now in business, the I think the insight is going to look a little bit different. There's typically some sort of facts around a business, the kind of things that we went through connection. But then there's the thing that you appreciate. Um, like, for example, if you're a building company, the insight might be something along the lines that, so most of the cost of having building materials, most of the variable cost of building materials is actually around transportation. If you're buying building materials, you will be well served by buying materials that are actually close to you, and that you don't, and where you're not responsible for warehousing them. That might change your perspective, because then instead of focusing on the difference in cents between the different suppliers of what's often commodities, you'll suddenly be looking at proximity and suddenly get a handle of, oh, this is actually how I manage my costs. For what it's worth, this is typically the hardest part of the exercise. Like, this is where we would make people do work and try to tell us, like, what is it that you have that's different, and what's the observation you made about the customer's businesses that is not typical, that most people ignore. Then you're not done yet. Even if you've blown their mind, you have to identify, is this worth doing? This in and of itself is a big topic, and again, there are different ways of doing this, and we could spend a lot of time on this. But the two ways we find you have to be able to deliver is, you have to be able to talk about the return on investment, the ROI, but then also the cost and risk of inaction. Um, Here, I'd argue what we see is a little bit of a lack of courage. Often, in that people fail to spell out how and why they think value is being delivered. Um, I think it's rightly so often, because value is often a multi-factor thing. Like realistically, it'll be very hard to literally attribute a dollar value to any one intervention. Because realistically, if you have a problem, you're not typically just going to do one thing to solve it. You'll do many things to solve it. And people know that, but I think that makes them scared. And then they stop talking about it altogether. But the point is, you should still talk about the factors that go into that. It's like, look, we will do X that does this, that hopefully has a knock-on effect, and you can start putting numbers to that. But more important, I think, and often ignores, is the cost and risk of inaction. And I think that's a mistake, partly because so ROI is hypothetical in the sense that it hasn't happened yet, but the cost of inaction is often very real. And the current risks with the business are very real. That's all around the current state. Um, if you're Sandler, for example, if you've been through the Sandler methodology, I think they're very good about this often. You need to deepen the pain, and you need to bring home the risk of staying with the status quo and not actually making a difference. And it can't just be sort of opportunity cost. That this isn't like the Amazon stock you should have bought in year 2000. This is more the fact that because you don't have enough insurance, your business is at loss of XYZ thing, or because your processes are cumbersome and introduce friction, you are being less productive than you could be. Um, so that's a little bit around business value, and again, a big topic, the kind of thing that we would spend quite a little bit of time working with people around. So, what are the 3-4 ways in which customers deliver value? Can we put those factors on a page and then identify, how it's going to resonate with different people at the customer? As I already made the point, and it is really around the different people of the customer. And again, in a first presentation, you wouldn't necessarily have a pitch that goes to each one of the different stakeholders, but you do need to have a sense for, who are the different people that are involved. I think last time Gartner measured like the average number of people involved in a B2B purchase, they came up with roughly 10 people. And it might not be 10, but I can assure you it is at least 2 or 3 different people. And I think the important thing to remember often is that the buyer, especially in B2B, is rarely actually a user. And that really matters because I see a lot of presentations that are actually about the user pain. Um, it's about how this will make better, how it will literally make somebody's day-to-day life better. And it's not that your buyer doesn't care, it's just that that's quite remote for them often. And again, back to our research, they need to know that the purchase is going to be acceptable to users, but they need other benefits. They need to know is this going to cut costs? Is this going to make them more productive? How aligned is this with the company's strategy? Because make that you know they have to make that pitch to somebody senior who's responsible for paying the bills. The um, and then finally, so here at this point, you've had a good conversation with somebody about the problem, you've spoken to them, you've shifted their perspective on a problem, you've given them a sense of the business value you've delivered, you've verified that your solution, can deliver benefits to all the different people involved in the purchase. Now, finally, are you ready for your key, to deliver your presentation and talk about your product and your solution? Um, and this is where you do a little bit of jujutsu, and again, go back to the beginning, I'd argue. And you talk about the key ingredients, like what is it that you've realized that the rest of the world has not, and what is it, and how is it that your solution capitalizes on this? So to do this, I thought I tell you a little bit of a story from a recent client, Stitch Health. They um, they they have software that helps patients manage medical trials. And it's a long story, but the gist of it is, so in the industry, if you're running medical trials, Medics, in particular, tend to think that the trial will last as long as it lasts, in the sense that the trial duration is determined by the clinical state of the patient, and that the disease state lasts as long as it does, and that's what determines the length of the trial. And so they tend to focus on just finding enough people who sort of fit that state and who hopefully you find enough people to be able to bring a trial to its successful conclusion. But what's happened over time is that trials of A become a lot more rigorous, and B, they tend to be about rarer, more complex diseases. And so that means you end up needing larger and larger numbers of patients. This is very, very expensive. Um, and it's very much it's a bit like a sales problem. You fill the funnel and you hope that at the end of them you have enough people you do. What Stitch Health did and what they realized was different was that people's assumption around the funnel were wrong in the sense that many of the people who sign up for a trial never actually even start it, and that most of the drop off happens really early. And this happens because there's considerable friction in participating in a medical trial. If any of you had the misfortune to either participate in one or known anybody who has, there's a huge amount of compliance and a huge amount of scheduling and a huge amount of paperwork that's involved with one of these things. Not surprisingly, for many of the patients, this is already not a great time of life. They just can't complete the paperwork. And so they don't proceed with the trial. And so that's all that money that was, recruiting this person wasted. You just hope you have enough of them. What they realized was that if you re-architected that patient experience and gave somebody an app that would put them a little bit more control of the experience and meant that they didn't literally have to call 10 people to make all the schedules, that you would radically reduce the number of people you needed and that more people would succeed at the trial. And so here, you know, they, here they can tell you that story and tell you that patient-centered design actually reduces patient churn. But again, the point of it is you wouldn't literally start with being patient-centered because that in and of itself is a generic thing. Like there is nobody in healthcare who wouldn't claim to be somehow patient-centered. Um, what they did differently was that they gave you both the rationale and told you how exactly they're patient-centered. They're patient-centered in a sense that they deeply understand the trial experience and they've worked to reduce the friction. And so at this point, having reframed expectations and having reframed the buyer's expectation that they should be focusing not just on recruitment but also on churn, they're now ready to present the difference. So here, hopefully the idea is that this puts all the different exhibits into context and gives meaning to the assertions in terms of what does it mean to make it easy, how exactly do you save time, and how and why does this lead to faster trials. Alan, anything, we worked on this one together, anything you wanted to add?
I think from this perspective, it's a great case study and really a great client to work with. Stitch is a wonderful organization. And from our standpoint, Timur and I worked through this whole process with them over the course of 3 to 4 weeks. And from beginning to end, arrived at a different message set, different messaging that they used in a conference. And they've used, as you can see here, this is from their website. So it really had a really nice impact on their business, and we felt it was a really nice partnership and a good story that shows how the process works from end to end. And nice case study there, Timur. Thank you.
Yeah. The so again,
So,
yeah.
yeah, go for it, Timur.
I was going to say it's like the transition with the sort of from here onwards. Having gone through the process, hopefully it makes a little bit more sense to everybody. And the thing I'd like to leave people with again is that you could think of it as a pitch deck, and when we work with people, we deliver a pitch deck, but there's really more to it, and any one of these pieces can go very, very deep. And you probably do need to go deeper with individuals on the different segments to make sure that they can have successful interactive conversations with different people. The and at this point, let's transition a little bit into a slightly more interactive proportion here with some examples, tools, and takeaways. The,
Sure. So we've been doing this, as Timur mentioned at the beginning, we're a relatively young organization, but we've been doing quite a number of projects around insights and insight messaging, and even more recently, it's become one of our like most sought out offerings that we have to our much a little bit to our surprise, Timur. I think you would agree with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But again, back to the data, nobody's happy with the process. Therefore, makes sense to focus on a better outcome.
So from our perspective, just a few things, and we can bounce examples back and forth, and if any questions come up in the chat. But what we've been seeing, a number of the things validate kind of assumptions and hunches that we've had, but there have been some other things that have been a surprise to us, even with mature organizations. Really, obviously, firstly, you want to make sure that you're engaging and as much as possible capturing and gathering customer observations, which many organizations don't even do that from the beginning. So that's a great practice, of course. Making sure that all the internal stakeholders and subject matter experts are involved as often in this process. What we find, to our surprise, is there are occasions where maybe marketing will run off with something without engaging with sales early enough, and then once they throw it over the fence to sales throws it back, and it becomes quite a cumbersome process. So really involving everybody from the beginning and throughout the process is best. What we do find is simpler is better. So once you're going to get out to market and start delivering this messaging, however it expresses itself, it needs to be a story that's compelling, but it also needs to be simple enough to retell and to share from that perspective and to deliver. I personally think the ones that we find the best or we observe that it's actually quite enjoyable to pitch and tell the stories and to present the insight messaging, and it's something that teams enjoy doing. And it's we've seen a couple of examples where going from the old way to the new way through this process, people just kind of have a deep like sense of relief, or they even have a fresh breath of fresh air. They just enjoy it is something that we've seen. And then what I often say is that you really need to start and end with customer value. So when you go through this process, understand if and where you're delivering value, where you're not delivering value, and always look at it from the perspective of the customer, at all times, really to be customer centric. Timur, anything from your perspective and what we've seen recently?
No, I mean, I would emphasize the sort of the multidisciplinary aspect of it a little bit. The you touched on that, but again, it really is so important that I think lots of people with different perspectives join this, and that it isn't just senior people. For example, like honestly, nobody has a better sense of how your customer actually uses your product than say your CSMs or your account managers. Even if they're relatively recent to the org, they will know what they have to do to make something work. It's important to get their perspective.
Yeah, good point.
The
So the flip side of the coin, things that we've observed that are less good practices, if you want to be optimistic or say
oh,
it that way.
yeah,
Things that we have observed that we should avoid is really there's this lack of freshness element where the messaging gets stale. It needs to be revisited, whatever cadence that is, if it's once a quarter, twice a year, or even at a minimum once a year, to make sure that it's fresh and relevant. That's extremely important. And you can kind of sense when messaging gets stale. The other component is overlooking in the enablement aspect. You just do the work and then just push it out, and without giving the proper guidance as to how to use it, and workshop it, get some proper training around it. I think that's important. The other thing, from the beginning, we talk about that whole customer experience. That's another thing that we observe is not embedding this across the entire customer journey, not only from the perspective of pushing it out to market, but also from listening and gathering new insights that you can use to inform future iterations of your pitch deck as well. And then, I already mentioned this before, making sure that you include all the teams, but you should also consider teams, systems, processes, and tooling, whatever it is that the organization uses. Make sure that this new approach, the new messaging, fits in with that into the machine, as you would say. Timur, anything on your side? No.
no, absolutely. I think that's a good list. The
So this could be my favorite slide, just because it's hard to pick your favorite one, right, Timur? It's like choosing your favorite children, right?
I mean,
So,
that's easy. No.
so the thing that's really nice about this is that you can see across each of the stages, we've created a checklist to kind of measure yourself against how you're doing and whether or not you're lacking any of these component parts. And it's really a practical way of gauging where you are and where you need to get to. And of course, you can do this in isolation, but we've been doing a lot of projects with teams, and we find it to be quite helpful to actually look and score your process across all of the stages and to see and to level set where you are as well. So, Timur, anything to add there?
No, that's great. I mean, I've actually have a question from Charlie there. Like, expand on avoiding not embedding across the customer journey.
Sure. Timur, you want to take that, or you want me to take that?
Sure. I mean, I think the thing is, it's easy to think of these things as sort of one-off exercises that where you just sort of you're coming up with a good insight that you're delivering in a one-off setting, typically during a first call. We think that would actually be a mistake, and that you really need to version it so that it appears everywhere. Like at the very beginning, it's obviously great outbound. Like, did you know we have a new way of looking at this? During the first pitch, it's like, look, we've reconceived the problem. But I think it goes further. It should arguably go into the entire experience of the platform, like during onboarding and embedding again. Like you need to reinforce the fact. So we're going to do this thing a little bit differently, or we're going to handle this a little bit differently for that reason. Um, and again, it has to be it like the value part, the value conversation in particular. That can't just be something a short conversation you had at the very beginning, but then not followed through. We'd gone through this in another call. Like I think right now, especially in SaaS, a lot of people are realizing that the value conversation was not quite completed in a sense that it's 6 9 months into an engagement and people are wondering, yes, but did we accomplish ABC that was supposed to drive A? So that's really what we mean with making sure that you embed these insights across the customer journey.
And I just to add one thing to that, Timur, as well. It's this idea of iteration and freshness factor and making sure that you're updating it. That applies to all customers. So those that you're reaching out to for the first time and those that have been with you for months or years. So you need to make sure that it's embedded across that experience so that it's a consistent and coherent message, no matter where the touch point is or where the relationship is with your customers.